My name is Swanson, and today we're going to be cooking kale 3 ways. People either love or hate kale. They say kale yeah or kale no. Even for the people that really hate kale, like my mother, these are 3 really great healthy recipes that you can probably sway the anti-kale people with. So first first I'd like to thank all the local farmers that grew this beautiful veg that we're using. When you buy kale at the farmer's market, this kale came from our friends at Gradia. When you buy kale from the farmer's market, it usually comes in bunches like this, tied together with a twist tie. So when you clean it, you just simply undo this twist tie, and then you take it leaf by leaf. The kale leaf has a pretty hard ridge that goes down the center of it. That you don't really want to eat that. It's fibrous. It's not that great. So what I do is I take and I hold my left hand, depending on which hand you use, with the stem, and I use my right hand to just rip the leaf off until you have something that looks like this. And then make sure you always wash your vegetables. So we already have a bowl of kale that's pre-washed here that we're going to use it, and by washing it you just simply run it under the water. For the kale chips, we want our kale to be torn into bite-sized pieces, so that way it's really a one-bite snack. This is great to trick kids into eating healthy. This is a great alternative to potato chips, and it's very easy and doesn't take a lot of time. So I have my washed kale into bite-sized pieces. Kale leaves have pretty strong ribs and veins. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour a little bit of olive oil, just a little drizzle over the top here. You don't want a bunch. You don't want your kale to be super oily and greasy. And then I'm going to take my kosher salt. Always use kosher salt. The reason being is that kosher salt has bigger granules than iodized salt, and you can actually feel how much you're putting on the kale. So I'm going to add a little bit of kosher salt to this. Don't add too much. You can always add more after the chips come out of the oven. After we have our salt and olive oil in the bowl, I'm going to take my hands and I'm going to massage the kale. What this does is it breaks down the cell structure of the vegetable and makes it a little bit easier to eat. So I'm not kind of squeezing the kale with my hands, but I'm gently massaging it. This is also a really great, easy snack for kids to get involved in. They can actually touch their food, and it's kind of fun for families. After I have the kale completely coated with olive oil and salt, then I'm going to take it out of the bowl with my fingers and lay it evenly on the sheet tray. You kind of want a lot of room between the kale because as the kale cooks, it's going to once again open the pores and release the liquid. And in order for it to get crispy, it needs a lot of space to crisp up on the baking sheet. And this is just a 9x13 baking sheet with foil that's lined on the top of it. I have preheated the oven to 350 degrees, and I'm going to put these kale chips in the oven for about 15 to 20 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to show you our next kale dish, which is going to be sauteed greens. The next dish we're going to do, now that our kale chips are in the oven, are braised greens. Braised greens are a southern classic, and that is where I was trained. So I am very much in love with the winter season of collards, Swiss chard, and kale. And those are the 3 winter greens that are pretty hardy right now in central Illinois. They're really great coming off the farms. These collards and chard are from Blue Moon Farms, and the kale is from our friends at Gradia Farm. So I'm going to start by taking a sauce pot and putting it on high. I have my mise en place already prepped into the side. This is just a clove of garlic that's from Gradia Farms that I peeled and sliced. This is a half an onion that is diced. This is some really great uncured bacon from Triple S Farms. That's also a local farm in the area. They have phenomenal pork and beef products. This was purchased at your local co-op. And then we have our mixture of our greens, our Swiss chard, our kale, and our collard greens. So I'm going to start by turning on the hot burner high, and I'm going to add my bacon. And now notice I didn't add any olive oil or any other fat with this, because the bacon is going to act as my fat to saute the garlic and the onions. So I'm going to make sure that this beautiful bacon is covering the bottom of the pan. We do want to brown this and make sure the fat renders. Renders means cook down. So that way we can get all of the flavors from this beautiful bacon. Now that we have the bacon nice and rendered, it has some really great, beautiful caramelized color on it, I'm going to add in my garlic and my onions. Now I don't want to drain off this extra grease because that's the fat that I'm going to use to saute my vegetables. So I'm going to start by adding in my sliced garlic, 1 clove of sliced garlic. Now garlic burns very, very easily, and there's nothing that'll ruin a dish faster than burned garlic. So I don't want to go and multitask right now while my garlic is sauteing. And I just want to watch it very closely and continue to stir it, move it around. After about 30 seconds of adding your garlic, go ahead and add your chopped onion. And this will give it really nice aromatics and smells. I'm moving my onions around. I want them to saute until they're about translucent, and then I'm going to add my greens into this pot. Again, I'm not draining the bacon fat because I want the greens to saute and roll in that bacon fat and give them extra flavor. You can also make this vegetarian if you want to by just simply omitting the bacon and using a little bit of olive oil to saute your onion and garlic. Now that the onions are almost translucent, I'm going to start to add my greens. I have my bowl of washed collard greens, Swiss chard, and kale in here, and what I'm going to do is while I'm adding it to my pot, I'm just going to break it up with my hands into bite-sized pieces. You don't want them super small because the greens will break down once they're in the pot. So I'm just slowly tearing them up. And then after I have about this much in the pot, about halfway, I'm going to start to stir these around so that they reach the bottom of the pot and they're coated in that really wonderful bacon fat. And once those cook down a little bit, then I have room in my pot to add the rest of it. So I'm going to add the rest of the greens, continuing to tear it up in bite-sized pieces. Make sure you drain all the water when you wash your greens really well. You don't want any water in this. And I'm going to stir this so that all of the greens are now coated with bacon fat. You really want to stir it really well so that way your onions and garlic don't continue to cook at the bottom of the pot. So you can see now that our greens are wilted. Everything is stirred in and mixed in really well. Now what we're going to do is all that goodness that formed on the bottom of the pot, that is all the flavor that we want to be incorporated into these braised greens. So I'm going to do what's called deglazing the pan. And it's pouring liquid into the bottom of the pan so it gets up all those crusties that are stuck to the bottom and it incorporates that back into the flavor. You can do this with white wine, red wine. I do it with a little bit of vinegar. Greens love vinegar, hot sauce, and butter. I'm kind of getting to the end of my red wine vinegar bottle. I love it so much. I use it pretty much for everything. So I'm going to deglaze the bottom of the pan with a little bit of red wine vinegar. It's enough to not really coat, it's just enough to coat the bottom of the pan without adding a bunch of liquid to it. But what it does is it gets all the black goodness off the bottom of the pan and onto the greens. After that's nice and mixed in and reduced, we're going to go ahead and add a little bit of chicken stock. Again, you can make this vegetarian just by switching this out for veg stock. I love these quick chicken stocks. Usually I make my own and I keep all of my vegetables and my roasted chicken in a freezer bag so that I can make stock whenever I'm ready. But in a pinch, this is really good stuff, and you can just buy this at any grocery store. So this whole time I've had my greens on medium-high heat. You can go a little bit slower if you're nervous. And I'm going to add about half of this, and I'll include this in the recipe. About half of the chicken stock. This is 4 cups of chicken stock, so you're really only going to need to use 2. And you're going to stir this around. And you want your greens to come back up to a boil. So I'm going to get everything mixed in, and then I'm going to step away from it for just a second and let the liquid heat back up again and come to a boil. Once it comes to a boil, we're going to do our finishing flavors. You want, just like a soup, you want this stock to reduce down about 1/4 of the way. You still want a little bit of liquid in it, but you really want it to not be as soupy as like a regular soup is. So we'll bring this to a boil, and don't worry about boiling your greens, especially collard greens. They have such a hard membrane that it really takes a lot to make them disintegrate into mush. So don't worry about overcooking your greens. Swiss chard is a little bit more tender than collards, so if you want to break it up a little bit, you can start by sauteing your collards just to get them incorporated a little bit more before you add your Swiss chard. Swiss chard is pretty much the consistency of spinach, so just remember that when you're adding in your vegetables. So we have our greens stewing down. The liquid is reducing in our pot. I have it on a pretty high boil because I want the liquid to reduce pretty quickly. So it's reduced by about 1/4 now. You can see that the greens are still predominant in the pot and that they're not completely submerged in the liquid. You really don't want them submerged in the liquid. Another name for this style of cooking is called pot liquor. Pot liquor is a famous term in the South, and it just means cooked with stock. In this pot liquor that we're making, we're using garlic and onions to flavor the chicken, garlic, onions, and local bacon to flavor the chicken stock. And then we're going to finish it by adding a little bit of acid, some hot sauce to round it out, and a lot of butter. Greens love hot sauce, acid, and butter. So that's what we're going to use to finish with these today. This isn't as heart healthy as the kale chips, so good thing we're making smoothies next. Alright. When I finish the braised greens with hot sauce, I like to use a really vinegary based hot sauce, unlike a Cholula or something like that. The vinegar based hot sauce pairs really well with the collard greens. And I'm going to be pretty liberal with this hot sauce. What happens is that when I add in the butter is so rich that it'll kind of numb out the flavor of the hot sauce and it'll balance everything out. So I've added my hot sauce. Next I'm going to add the juice of half a lemon. Remember, greens like acid, heat, and butter. And then I'm going to finish it by adding 1 stick of butter. And I'm just going to unwrap it and drop it right in. As the greens continue to cook, the butter is going to melt, and you want to continually stir the pot at this time so that the butter emulsifies into the rest of the stock, and it actually thickens it. It acts as a thickening agent. So we're going to stir this. And this entire time I've had my braised greens on high heat. If that's too fast for you and you feel like you don't have enough time to do the other things you're trying to do, feel free to turn it down and take your time. Now you can start to smell that real porky pot liquor flavor. It's starting to smell good. Our butter has now incorporated into the rest of the sauce, and it's thickened it just a little bit. You don't want your sauce to be super thick because you don't want it to really take the mouthfeel or create a mouthfeel that is thicker than what the greens are. You still want to be able to taste those greens. So I'm continuing to reduce it. Reducing it is going to keep making it thick. And I do want it to thicken up just a little bit, but it's almost there. So now we're at the point where we're ready to taste. And remember, I added a little bit of salt at the beginning, and I'm really going to finish it with salt at the end. Keep in mind that the bacon is really, really salty. So for this dish, it's very easy to over season it. So I'm actually pretty happy with the salt content right now, and I am not going to add any more. This dish is pretty much done. As you can see, this liquid is really great with fish or chicken. You can strain some of this pot liquor out and thicken it with a quick slurry. Slurry is just equal parts of cornstarch and water. And add it very, very slowly, and you get a nice, wonderful, thick, porky sauce. I can't remember what I said last time at the end. Oh, now we're moving on to kale smoothies.
Yep.
Okay.
Say, I'm going to count 3, 2, 1, and they're going to say, now that the now that the pot liquor's done, let me show you how to make a kale smoothie.
Okay.
All right,
Okay.
ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1.
Now that our braised greens are finished and ready to go, we're going to move over and I'll show you the last thing we're going to do with kale, and that's a kale smoothie. And this is a great dish for all of you kale haters. Alright, we have finished our braised greens. Our kale chips are still working. So while we're waiting for our kale chips to come out of the oven, we're going to do one last recipe with kale. Now this recipe, I kind of saved the best for last. This is great if you do not like kale. All of these wonderful fruits kind of mask the flavor, but you still get the rich vitamins that the greens provide. I actually am putting also a little bit of the rainbow chard that we used in our braised greens into this smoothie as well. And I promise you, you will not be able to taste the greens. So I'm starting off the smoothie. You need just a regular blender, nothing fancy. But I'm going to put a little bit of my liquid down at the bottom. This is Greek yogurt. I highly recommend this brand. It's very wonderful. Be sure to get the non-flavored yogurt because you want to add in the flavors and control what it tastes like at the end by yourself. So I'm going to use a little bit of this Siggy's yogurt. This is just a, let's see, how much is this? This is just 5 ounces. You can buy it in larger containers if you're a smoothie person and have it on hand. It's also a really great thing to eat as a dessert. If you're dieting and you're looking for something sweet, use a little bit of plain Greek yogurt with some berries on top and a little honey drizzled on top of that, and it's a really healthy way to kind of satisfy your sweet tooth. So I'm putting in my container of yogurt. I want to put this in first in the blender so that the blade of the blender is able to spin before I put my harder ingredients in. So I'm going to add the yogurt, and then I'm going to take my strawberries and I'm going to add all of my strawberries. This is 1 quart of strawberries, and I'm going to add the whole thing in. And then I'm going to take a banana and I'm going to add 1 banana into the smoothie as well. And I'm just going to peel it right in. This is a really great recipe. It doesn't dirty up a lot of dishes. This is great as an after dinner dessert. I make smoothies in the morning. It's a great way to have breakfast on the go. And then I'm going to take my greens. And these have been washed and destemmed just like I showed you for the kale chips and the braised greens. So we're only using the leaves, and you kind of want to tear the leaves into bite-sized pieces so that your blender doesn't get caught up and die, like mine often does if I'm trying to blend things that are too hard for it. I'm going to leave my milk and my honey for last. Honey, like everything else, think of it as a seasoning, so it's just like salt. I want to balance this out with a little bit of sweetness because the greens are going to be a little bit bitter and the fruit, especially the strawberries, are going to be a little bit tart. So I do want to add a little bit of honey to this just to balance it out. The reason I use honey instead of sugar is that honey is a lot more mild. It doesn't have the bite or the intensity that sugar does. So I like using honey or agave nectar more than I like using sugar if I'm not doing pastries and baking. So I am going to start this out with a little bit of honey on top, and then we'll also finish it if it needs more with honey and salt. I'm going to add a little bit of my kosher salt on top of this. I think it's a common falsehood that people think you only salt savory dishes. Well, that's not true. Everything needs a little bit of salt to bring out its natural flavors, even something like chocolate chip cookies. Alright, so I have everything in my blender, and I'm going to take my blender and my milk, and we're going to start mixing it. I'm going to slowly add my milk to my mixture so that it'll start to spin, and then you control how much milk you add by the consistency that you're looking for in your smoothie. Now that Mark brought the camera a little closer, you guys can have a close-up view of how this blending is going to go down. So I'm going to turn it on. You can see that the yogurt adds enough consistency, loose consistency at the bottom of the blender to start blending this. So what we're going to do is with a spatula or your fingers, as long as your hands are clean, I'm going to push these greens down into the mixture so that they also get blended. Now that the kale is pushed down to the bottom and I've cleaned my fingers again, I'm going to turn it on. And if it's not moving enough or it's not the consistency that I want, then I'm going to add just a little bit of milk. You want to add it very little bit at a time. If you add too much, don't worry, you can always throw another banana in to make it thicker. Time to taste and finish the dish. So if you have kids that are scared of the color green, to eat anything green like some people have, don't worry about this green color. You can substitute blueberries for strawberries and this smoothie will be a beautiful, vibrant purple color. So just think about what you're putting in the smoothie to modify the color. I don't mind drinking green. It equates to being healthy for me, even if it has a little honey and fruit in it. So I'm going to get my testing spoon, I'm going to give it a final test and alter it with a little bit more honey if it needs it, or a little bit more salt. The kale smoothie is the consistency that I like now. It turned out to add about a half cup of milk, which we'll put in the recipe at the end of this cooking segment. It came out to a beautiful green color. Again, you can change the color based on what fruit you're adding in. Don't worry about making too much of this smoothie. This is something that you can make a big batch ahead of time, maybe on the weekend, and then just store it in the refrigerator and take 8-ounce portions in the morning as you're getting ready to go off to work. So I'm going to pour this out now, and these hold for a couple days in the fridge, so don't worry too much. And this is packed full full with vitamins and antioxidants and all kinds of stuff. Like I said, this can be great as a dessert, or it can be great as a quick breakfast on your way to work in the morning. Now, don't forget, we still had the kale chips in the oven. As we were on break, I pulled those out, and this is what they look like. So they have a little bit of brown to them, but overall they should be nice and crispy. And this is a great after-school snack. This is a great accompaniment with dinner. And it's a nice, healthy, easy way to get your kids to eat green vegetables. I hope you enjoyed this segment, and happy eating.